Welcome to Echoes of the Past, where history's shadows still speak. If you love dark mysteries hidden in America's forgotten corners, go ahead, hit that like button, share this story with a friend, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's step back into Newport, 1889, and uncover the fate of Isabella Fairmont. Imagine this. It's a quiet morning, March 15th, 1889. The staff at Newport's most exclusive hotel, the Belmont, are making their usual rounds. But when they reach room 237, something's wrong, very wrong. The curtains are still drawn. 2 champagne glasses from last night's private gathering sit untouched on the marble table. A half-written letter lies abandoned on the desk. No signature, no clue who it was meant for. And the room's most important guest, gone, vanished into the fog like she'd never been there. Her name was Isabella Fairmont, a woman so famous, so magnetic, that presidents and princes vied for her attention. And yet, in one night she disappeared without a trace. All that remained was the faint scent of her French perfume, and a mystery that would haunt America's high society for the next 40 years. What investigators uncovered behind closed doors would rock Newport's gilded mansions to their core. The revelations were so explosive, so dangerous to the city's elite, that 3 powerful families quietly paid enormous sums to seal the police records forever. But before we dive into the tangled web of lies, power, and betrayal that led to Isabella Fairmont's disappearance, do me a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell so you never miss stories like this, the ones they tried to erase from history. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story doesn't just belong to Rhode Island's gilded shores. It may reach far further than anyone dared imagine. To understand why Isabella's vanishing sent shockwaves through America's wealthiest circles, we have to go back to where it all began, Newport, 1881. This wasn't just a summer retreat. It was the throne room of America's new aristocracy. Railroads, steel, shipping, the fortunes that built the country built Newport's palaces to here. Mansions cost more than entire towns, and every dinner party was a chessboard for power. And among them, Isabella reigned supreme. Born Isabella Catherine Aldrich in 1859, she had everything society craved. Old Boston blood on her mother's side, new shipping wealth on her father's. That combination, irresistible to Newport's carefully controlled social machine. Her father, Cornelius Aldrich, made millions moving goods along the East Coast. Her mother proudly traced her roots back to the earliest settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Add to that Isabella's raven-black hair, ice-blue eyes, and a figure Parisian designers adored, and you've got the perfect queen for America's summer kingdom. When she married Theodore Fairmont in 1878, heir to a vast Pennsylvania steel fortune, it was the wedding of the decade. Their Newport cottage, Rosecliff Manor, was no mere house. 70 rooms, Italian marble, gardens, so elaborate they needed a staff of 20 just to stay alive. And Isabella used it well. Her summer parties, legendary. Senators brushed shoulders with European royalties. Multi-million-dollar deals were struck over caviar and champagne. One invitation could secure your family's social standing for generations. Newspapers couldn't get enough of her. The Newport Daily News ran a weekly column, Mrs. Fairmont's Week, tracking her every move, from her charity work to her guest lists. She funded Newport's first real theatre. She imported musicians from Europe for her soirees. Politicians courted her favor. Railroad barons asked for her advice. Even President Chester Arthur had dined at her table. But here's the thing about climbing high in a world built on whispers. The fall is brutal. Newport society ran on secrets, half-truths, and the constant threat of scandal. A single rumor could undo years of careful reputation building. And in 1884, the first crack in Isabella's perfect life appeared. At first, it was nothing. A quiet dinner. A name mentioned too often. Jonathan Pembroke, a brilliant, young architect hired to expand Newport's mansions. Handsome, mysterious. The kind of man who made matrons nervous and daughters curious. He wasn't just skilled with stone and wood. He was magnetic. Dark hair forever falling into his eyes. A lean frame. A quiet intensity. Danger wrapped in charm. Isabella met him while working on a church expansion committee. One glance across a mahogany table, and according to those who were there, the air changed. What started as professional collaboration quickly turned into something far riskier soon. Pembroke was a regular at Rosecliff Manor, always under the guise of architectural work. But the staff noticed the laughter that came a little too easily. The hours they'd vanish into the gardens or her private study. The letters handwritten unmistakably his. Theodore Fairmont Practical. Busy, devoted to his steel empire, didn't see it. Or maybe didn't want to. What happened next would change everything. And that's where our story truly begins. So, stick with me. Like, share, and subscribe. Because Isabella Fairmont's disappearance isn't just a story of love and betrayal. It's a story of power, cover-ups, and a darkness that stretched far beyond one foggy night in Newport. He praised Jonathan Pembroke's architectural genius, even congratulated Isabella on choosing the perfect man for the job. That blindness, it would come back to haunt him. But in the summer of 1884, Theodore Fairmont saw only what he wanted to see, a dazzling wife who managed their social world with grace, intelligence, and a flawless smile. But here's the thing about Newport. People watched constantly. It was like living under a microscope. A kind of surveillance that would have impressed Europe's best spy networks. By August, the whispers had grown louder. By September, there was no denying it anymore. The city's elite had made up their mind. Isabella Fairmont was having an affair. The proof, circumstantial but deadly in a world built on image and moral arithmetic. She'd been spotted slipping into Pembroke's temporary studio on Thames Street, seen at the casino, leaning in close, heads bent together like they were sharing secrets no one else could hear. And the final devastating blow. Mrs. Cornelius, Vanderbilt's own maid, swore she'd witnessed a passionate embrace in the conservatory during a private dinner. And just like that, the very machine that had lifted Isabella to the top turned against her with cold, precise efficiency. Invitations slowed. Friends cooled. The intricate dance of Newport's social calendar began to shift, subtly at first, until Isabella Zors wasn't at the center anymore. She was a problem to be managed, a scandal to be avoided. But Isabella, she didn't flinch. Friends would later say she seemed intoxicated, not by alcohol, but by a love so consuming it shut out common sense. She kept seeing Pembroke, bolder now, almost daring Newport to challenge her. That defiance, thrilling as it might sound, only made her fall faster. Then came October 12th, 1884, the day it all went public. The New York Herald, front page, Newport's fallen angel, written by a society columnist who went by only one name, Observer, and the story, brutal, detailed, merciless. It exposed everything, the secret meetings, the money transfers, the whispers turned into ink. But buried in that article was something no one expected, something even Newport's gossip-hardened elite weren't ready for. Pembroke, it claimed, wasn't just a charming architect. He was drowning in gambling debts. He had a history, other cities, other women, wealthy, lonely, and generous, and worse still. The paper claimed Isabella had been bankrolling him. Money from her personal accounts. Art sold quietly from the Fairmont collection. Jewels that had vanished without explanation, all to cover his debts. When Theodore Fairmont read those words, it wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. His wife hadn't simply been unfaithful. She'd been conned, played, while the city watched. That night, October 13th, Theodore confronted Isabella in the library at Rosecliff Manor. He would later recount it to private investigators. At first, she denied it. Then, faced with bank records, she crumbled. Yes, she admitted she'd been seeing Pembroke. Yes, she'd given him money, not out of weakness, but out of love. Pure love. Theodore's response was cold, immediate, absolute. End it, now. Leave Newport. Return to Boston for the winter. Submit to a quiet year of carefully planned charity work. The only hope of salvaging their name Isabella's reply. Just as fierce, she loved Pembroke. Her marriage had been a mistake. She wanted a divorce, a word that, in 1884, detonated like a social bomb. The staff would later say the argument lasted hours. Raised voices, slamming doors, Isabella's heels echoing on the marble staircase. By morning, Theodore looked like a man who had aged 10 years overnight, and the damage went far beyond gossip. When lawyers dug into the family's finances, they discovered the shocking truth. Isabella had transferred nearly $50,000 to Pembroke in 4 months, over $1 million in today's money. Even worse, the art and jewelry she claimed she'd updated in the collection. Many had been sold far below their value. Rushed deals, suspiciously quiet, sloppy in ways that suggested desperation or manipulation. Theodore's investigators followed the trail back to Pittsburgh, then Richmond. Everywhere they went, they found the same pattern. Pembroke, charming, talented, dangerous. Women with money, secret relationships, large sums gone. Then he'd vanished. When Theodore laid out the evidence to Isabella, he expected horror. Instead, she defended him, insisted their love was different, that what he'd done before didn't matter. Their story, their love, was real. And that's when Theodore realized something far worse than betrayal. Isabella couldn't see the truth anymore. She'd fallen so deeply into Pembroke's web that she couldn't tell fantasy from fact. By November 1884, Isabella Fairmont wasn't just scandalous, she was infamous. The Herald's piece had been reprinted nationwide. People devoured it. Wealth, beauty, betrayal, downfall, everything they loved in one ruinous, irresistible package. Theodore issued one final ultimatum: publicly renounce Pembroke, disappear, put from society for a year, accept strict control over her finances and every public move. In exchange, he'd keep the divorce off the table, and maybe, just maybe, repair what was left of their reputation. And then Isabella vanished. For 3 days, no one knew where she'd gone. Not her staff, not Theodore, not a single soul in Newport. Finally, on November 15th, her personal maid found her alive, unharmed, and living under a fake name, in a modest boarding house in Providence. When Theodore and his lawyers confronted her, Isabella stunned them. What she offered wasn't an apology, it was a plan. A dangerous, outrageous plan. She said she'd blow the lid off Newport's polite society, expose the rot at its core. According to Isabella, her affair with Pembroke hadn't just been passion, it had been access. Access to secrets. Pembroke, she claimed, had talked too much. In between whispered confessions and stolen hours, he'd let slip details about the homes he'd worked on, hidden rooms, secret safes, concealed passages, places where some of the richest, most powerful families in America hid their dirtiest business. And Isabella had names. She said Senator William Blackstone kept bribery evidence tucked behind a fireplace panel, that railroad baron Charles Pion hid forged land documents beneath his wine cellar, and most shocking of all, that 3 of Newport's wealthiest dynasties had conspired to manipulate steel prices during federal contract talks. True or not, the threat was nuclear. If she went public, the fallout wouldn't stop at Newport. Investigations, ruined reputations, destroyed fortunes. Nobody would walk away untouched. So, on November 20th, 1884, a secret meeting took place. Private dining room, Belmont Hotel. 5 families, 1 socialite. 6 hours of tense negotiation. Isabella's terms were bold. $100,000 in cash, Pembroke's debts erased, and safe passage to Europe for both of them. Permanent exile in exchange for permanent silence. By midnight, a deal was struck. but not the one she'd expected. Yes, she'd get the money. Yes, Pembroke's debts would vanish. But the families had their own conditions. Isabella and Pembroke would leave separately, have no contact for at least 2 years, sign binding agreements never to return or reach out to anyone in Newport's inner circle. She agreed. But witnesses said something about her felt different, distracted, almost as if she wasn't really in the room anymore. When asked if she understood the finality of her exile, she only smiled. Some sacrifices are worth making for love. On November 25th, the money was delivered. Isabella was booked to sail December 2nd. Aboard the Britannica out of New York. Pembroke had already left, 3 days ahead of her, on a different ship bound for England. It should have been the end, the costliest love story in American high society. But Isabella Mont never boarded the Britannica, and what happened in those last 7 days has haunted Newport ever since. Her final week reads like a carefully staged farewell, or the unraveling of someone preparing for something darker. She left the Providence boarding house, checked into the Belmont Hotel under her maiden name, Isabella Aldrich. A symbolic return to the woman she'd been before everything fell apart. Staff said she seemed calm. To calm, she ate alone, spoke little, wrote constantly, a dozen letters at least, mailed but never traced. No one knew who they were for. On November 28th, she made a strange request, a portrait session. Marcus Steinberg, a rising society photographer, spent 2 hours photographing her in different poses, different lighting. She paid cash, waited while he developed the plates. He'd later describe her as heartbreakingly composed, still beautiful, but with eyes that carried both fierce resolve and quiet despair. She adjusted a ruby brooch repeatedly, told him it had belonged to her grandmother. When Steinberg casually suggested another sitting after her return from Europe, she smiled faintly and said, "That won't be necessary. Those photographs, found decades later among Steinberg's estate, show Isabella elegant, serene, and somehow final. In some frames, she isn't looking at the camera at all, but past it, like she was seeing someone else entirely." Then came December 1st. Isabella hired a carriage and spent the day visiting the landmarks of her life. The casino where deals and friendships had been struck, Trinity Church, the site of her wedding, the cliff walk where she'd strolled with presidents and princes. According to her driver, she sat silently at each stop for long minutes, like she was saying goodbye, and then nothing. No ship, no trace, just a vanishing act so complete it would baffle detectives, crush reputations, and leave one of America's richest cities haunted for generations. We're only just getting to the heart of it. That night, Isabella returned to the Belmont Hotel and quietly ordered a late dinner. Robert Sterling, the night manager, carried the tray himself. Later, he'd recall how strangely composed she looked, agitated. Yes, but there was a sense of determination in her movements. She'd changed into a stunning evening gown of deep blue silk, her jewelry catching the lamplight as she paced the room, that ruby brooch glinting like a heartbeat in the dark. She thanked me for everything," Sterling would say later, and gave me a tip far beyond what anyone would expect. When he tried to refuse, Isabella smiled faintly and said generosity was one of the few true luxuries money could buy, and she intended to use it while she still could. The last confirmed sighting came at 11:30 p.m. on December 1st, 1889. William Chen, the hotel's night clerk, watched as Isabella descended the grand staircase wearing a dark traveling coat, a small leather valise in hand. Bessie moved with purpose, not panic, polite, distant. When Chen offered to call for a carriage, she declined, saying her arrangements were already in place. Through the window, he saw her step into the heavy Newport fog, and then nothing. Within seconds, she was gone, swallowed by the winter mist, when she didn't appear for her scheduled steamship departure the next morning. Theodore Fairmont alerted the authorities. What followed was one of the strangest, most frustrating investigations Newport police had ever seen. Chief Detective Samuel Harrison, steady, methodical, and unshaken by the gossip swirling around the case, led the inquiry. His team retraced every step of Isabella's final week. They spoke to hotel staff, carriage drivers, shopkeepers. A portrait began to form, a woman putting her life in order, quietly closing doors as if preparing for a journey she didn't plan to return from. But the clues left behind in her room told a different story. Her belongings were carefully arranged, but key items were missing. A diamond bracelet, last seen days earlier, had vanished. Drafts of farewell letters sat on her write-in desk, but no final versions could be found. Panned in the fireplace, fragments of a half-burned document, numbers, names, J.P. and W.B., Jonathan Pembroke, William Blackstone. Two names Isabella had once threatened to expose. Harrison's next move was obvious: find Jonathan Pembroke. But when he reached out to the London address Pembroke was supposedly staying at, he hit a wall. The address was a mail drop. Pembroke himself vanished. British authorities scoured hotel registries. Nothing. The ship's manifest confirmed Pembroke had booked passage, but the records revealed he'd never boarded. The deeper Harrison dug, the darker the picture became. Pembroke's career, impressive on the surface, was laced with unfinished projects, unpaid debts, and a suspicious pattern of wealthy women who'd somehow been drawn into his orbit. Even worse, the secret rooms and hidden compartments Isabella had described turned out to be real. Newport inspectors confirmed at least 3 mansions had precisely the kinds of concealed spaces she'd claimed, all designed and built by Pembroke, long before their affair ever became public. It now looked less like romance and more like a carefully staged operation. Then came a knock that would twist the investigation again. An elderly seamstress, Mrs. Margaret Winthrop, requested a private meeting with Harrison. Shaking, she swore she had information, but only if her identity remained hidden. Her story was chilling. On the night Isabella vanished, she'd been working late at the Pionton Mansion sewing room. Near midnight, she'd heard voices in the courtyard. Curious, she crept to a window and saw Isabella meeting with 2 men she didn't recognize. The conversation grew heated. Isabella gestured wildly. The men stood silent, watchful. After 20 minutes, one of them handed Isabella a package or envelope. Then, without a word, she left with them in a closed carriage. If true, it changed everything. But it also raised the question no one could answer. Was Isabella Fairmont negotiating her own disappearance, or being escorted to her doom? That's where the trail turns from strange to legendary. Because what happened after that night would ripple through Newport's elite for decades. She couldn't describe the men clearly. Bad light, bad angle. And honestly, her reputation in Newport wasn't spotless. Fired before for talking too much about other people's secrets. Detective Harrison almost tossed her story aside, until she mentioned something no outsider could have guessed. The ruby brooch, the one staff had noticed, catching the moonlight like a red spark in the dark. That detail changed everything. And just when it seemed like this case couldn't get darker, it did. If this is already giving you chills, share it with someone who loves a good mystery. Hit like to help keep these stories alive, and subscribe, so you never miss what comes next. Because what happens now is beyond shocking. The big break didn't come from a crime scene. It came from the money. Harrison and a federal financial investigator dug into the accounts of the 5 families who'd cut the deal to send Isabella away. And what they found was terrifying. The $100,000, her ticket to Europe, had been moved to a New York bank account under the name I.C. Aldrich, Isabella's maiden name. But here's the thing. The money just sat there. No withdrawals, no movement. And the handwriting on the forms, not Isabella's. Either someone had been pretending to be Isabella, or the whole exile deal had been a carefully constructed lie, a trap disguised as a bargain. Then came the gut punch. Jonathan Pembroke, the charming architect who started it all, wasn't missing. He was dead. Found in a Boston boarding house on November 30th, one day before Isabella vanished. Official cause, heart failure. But witnesses saw 2 well-dressed men visiting him for hours that same day, then leaving quietly. The timing was too perfect. And if Isabella was planning to meet Pembroke after December 1st, she'd been walking straight into danger, without knowing he was already gone. Now, Harrison's team had 2 targets. The mysterious men spotted with Pembroke, and possibly the same ones seen with Isabella the night she disappeared. The lead that cracked it wide open pointed straight at one of the era's most feared names in private security, the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Several Newport families had hired them to contain the scandal. But the files Harrison got through federal pressure read like something out of a nightmare. They hadn't just been watching Isabella and Pembroke. They'd been planning what they delicately called permanent solutions. Chilling phrases neutralize the threat, ensure permanent discretion. And it gets worse. Pembroke's architectural plans, those secret compartments he'd built, one in particular stood out. A hidden chamber beneath the wine cellar at the Petton mansion. Big enough to hide more than papers. Big enough to hide a person. On Valentine's Day, 1890, Harrison and a team of federal agents, police, and a structural expert descended on the Petton mansion. Charles Petton had fled to New York the moment the warrant hit, leaving the grand home eerily still, a frozen monument to wealth, privilege, and now, Horror at first glance, the wine cellar looked normal. Imported bottles, perfect stonework, nothing out of place. But the inspector's measurements didn't lie 8 feet of empty, unaccounted for space behind the north wall. The crew went to work. Picks, crowbars, stone gave way to stone. Then a hollow sound. Behind the false wall, they found it, a hidden room, 10 feet square, lined, silent as a tomb. And in the far corner, wrapped in what had once been a silk evening cloak, lay Isabella Fairmont. The scandal that started with whispers had ended in murder and in silence. It was still there, that ruby brooch, the one the hotel staff and photographer Marcus Steinberg had noticed, still pinned to the tattered silk of Isabella's cloak. The fabric had rotted in the damp air, but the brooch gleamed like a drop, with blood in the dark. The coroner's report was worse than anyone expected. Isabella hadn't been shot or stabbed. She'd been poisoned. Chloral hydrate, a killer's choice in the late 19th century. Easy to slip into a drink, hard to detect after death. Traces of champagne were found in a crystal glass nearby. But here's the part that haunts every detective who ever touched this case. She didn't die right away. Scratch marks covered, delined walls, desperate clawing scrapes, proof that Isabella had been alive, conscious, fighting, as the poison slowed her heart. A half-written note still clutched in her hand hinted at names, accusations, but the paper had decayed too far to read. The missing socialite had now become the victim of a murder conspiracy unlike anything Newport, maybe even America, had ever seen. Detective Harrison's reconstruction of events was chilling. The exile deal, a scam, a perfect cover to lure Isabella into silence forever. The 2 men who met her that night, Pinkerton operatives, hired killers, inexpensive suits, working for the richest families in the country. She'd been told she was finalizing her escape to Europe. Instead, she was drugged, locked in a soundproof room, and left to die. Even Pembroke, the charming architect at the heart of it all, had been killed. His heart failure now clearly murder. He knew too much about the hidden room, put the family crimes those walls were hiding. His death, timed 1 day before hers, removed the only other person who could have blown the conspiracy wide open. The arrests that followed should have changed everything. Big names: Charles Petton, Senator William Blackstone, 3 other titans of Gilded Age society, charged with conspiracy. 2 Pinkerton agents indicted for murder. It was huge. And then it all fell apart. Witnesses started changing their stories. Evidence vanished from police custody. Pinkerton's Boston office went up in flames, and with it every file on the case. The federal investigation slowed to a crawl under jurisdictional disputes. Detectives were reassigned, warrants challenged. The clock ran out, and then Theodore Fairmont, Isabella's grieving husband, withdrew his cooperation. Publicly, He said he wanted peace. Privately, the money trail told another story. Government contracts, social rehabilitation, financial security, bought in exchange for silence. By the fall of 1890, it was over. Cases dismissed, charges dropped, agents vanished. Isabella Fairmont was buried quietly on October 15th, 1890, at Newport's Island Cemetery. Fewer than 20 people stood at the graveside. No headlines, no eulogies, just silence. But the story didn't die with her. In the years that followed, something like justice started to seep through the cracks. Not in courts or papers, but in lives' unravelings. The families who thought they'd buried their sins with Isabella found those same sins rotting the foundations of their fortunes. Charles Petain, the man whose basement became her tomb, never recovered. Friends whispered that he heard her at night, that he saw her in mirrors. He abandoned his Newport mansion, fled to New York. But peace never followed, because sometimes ghosts don't care about property lines. What if I told you that the very people who killed Isabella Fairmont ended up destroying themselves? It started quietly, like a rot spreading through marble halls. The massive business empire that Charles Petain had built, the same one Isabella had been ready to expose, began to crack. Federal investigators, digging into contracts completely unrelated to her murder, uncovered a web of fraud, bid rigging, price manipulation, everything Isabella had claimed. By 1895, Petain Steel was collapsing, dragged into bankruptcy and federal prosecution. During the seizures, they found hidden papers, exactly the ones Isabella had threatened to reveal. Petain didn't live long enough to face the trial. In 1897, he was found dead in his New York mansion. The papers called it heart failure. Those who saw the scene whispered suicide. Senator William Blackstone's fall was just as dramatic. In 1892, an entirely separate corruption probe turned up bribes right where Isabella said they'd be tucked behind his library fireplace. Documents proved he'd been selling. Senate votes to the highest bidder. Expelled. Disgraced. He died broke in 1899. His fortune eaten alive by legal fees, one by one. Every family involved met ruin. Railroad tycoon Thomas Hartwell, exposed for price fixing, another of Isabella's warnings. His suicide in 1896 made national headlines. Banking heir Robert Sterling, his crooked lending left him exposed when the panic of '93 hit. His fortune vanished overnight, and the Pinkertons, the hired hands who carried out the murder, they weren't spared either. As labor violence tore through the 1890s, Congress began digging into the agency. What they found destroyed its reputation. Illegal surveillance, corruption, violence. By 1900, the once feared Pinkerton name was poison, and the agency was facing criminal charges in multiple states. Detective Samuel Harrison, the man who'd carried Isabella's case on his back, never let it go. He retired in 1905, but not quietly. He spent his final years piecing together every ugly detail, keeping files no one else dared to keep. When he died in 1918, those private notes surfaced inside them. A chilling conclusion: Isabella's death wasn't a tragic one-off. It was part of a network, a system of America's richest families silencing their problems with violence. And worse, they'd gotten away with it. That precedent, that money could bend justice, lingered, poisoning courts and police long after the Gilded Age ended. For decades in Newport, Isabella's name was spoken like a warning, but people missed the real lesson. They told their daughters to avoid scandal, to avoid dangerous affairs. But what they should have said was this: the rich weren't just powerful, they were dangerous. The mansion where Isabella had died stood empty for over 20 years. Neighbors swore it wasn't truly empty. Lights in dark windows, winter nights, carrying the sound of distant music, laughter, the faint trace of French perfume in sealed rooms. In 1920, a Catholic charity turned the house into an orphanage. But the haunting didn't stop. Children saw a woman in elegant dress wandering the halls. Staff heard scratching from the basement walls, the same place Isabella had left her desperate marks. By 1935, after a string of tragic accidents, the church shut it down. In 1938, the house came down brick by brick, but not before construction crews uncovered more hidden chambers. And in one, belongings, not Isabella's, others, missing persons, forgotten victims. And then there was the ruby brooch, Isabella's signature piece, blood red, elegant, damning, became legend. After years in police storage, it went to Theodore Fairmont, who quickly handed it off to a Boston museum. In 1895, it vanished. Not lost, stolen. It kept resurfacing, like a curse that refused to die. Each time it reappeared, death followed. A New York socialite's suicide in 1902. A Philadelphia heiress's mysterious passing in 1918. Always the same. Always tragic. Theodore never remarried. He lived quietly, almost penitently, until his death in 1923. In his will, a clue, a foundation built to investigate unsolved crimes against women. Not a word about Isabella, but the message was clear. The Fairmont Foundation spent decades quietly funding cases no one else would touch, shining faint light into dark, expensive corners where justice rarely reached. No case ever matched Isabella's. None shook society like hers. But piece by piece, that money chipped away at a truth Newport's elite had buried. Power may silence voices, but it doesn't bury the truth forever. Some mysteries don't fade with time. They grow louder. For decades, people thought they knew the story of Isabella Fairmont, who killed her, why they did it, how the cover-up unfolded. But one question refused to die. What happened to the evidence she risked everything to gather? Detectives scoured her hotel room, her belongings, every place she'd stepped in those final, desperate days. Nothing. It was as if the documents, the proof of Newport's darkest secrets, had vanished with her. Detective Harrison never bought it. He always believed Isabella had hidden them, that she'd known the danger closing in and planted a trail for justice to find long after she was gone. He searched for years. He died never knowing how right he was. Fast forward to 1954. Renovations. At the Belmont Hotel uncovered a loose brick in the basement. Behind it, a sealed envelope, marked with Isabella's initials and dated November 30th, 1889. Inside, everything: financial ledgers, letters between Newport's richest families and corrupt officials, architectural plans marking secret chambers in more than a dozen mansions. 65 years after her murder, Isabella's voice finally broke through the silence and confirmed every accusation she'd ever made. A conspiracy stretching far beyond Newport, into politics, courts, boardrooms all across New England. But by then, every player in her murder was dead. Statutes of limitation had run out. No trials, no sentences. Only the truth, finally laid bare. The hotel donated the papers to the Newport Historical Society, where they sit today behind glass, an exhibit on the darker side of America's Gilded Age. Visitors say the air changes when they stand before her final letters. A chill, a weight, as if Isabella herself is still there, watching, making sure her story is told at last. And the hotel room, room 237, didn't quiet down either. Guests and staff reported the same strange things. The smell of French perfume, soft weeping in an empty room, that prickling feeling of being watched. Management eventually removed the room number and turned it into storage. But the whispers continued. In 1979, historian Dr. Margaret Steinberg published the book that put it all together. The Newport Murders: Wealth, Power, and Justice in Gilded Age America, a bestseller. Her conclusion was brutal. Isabella's murder wasn't personal. It was business. A cold, calculated move by men who treated human life like a ledger entry. And the fascination never stopped. Even in the 21st century, the case drew new eyes. In 2019, the FBI's Cold Case Unit announced a fresh forensic review. They admitted prosecution was impossible now, but that wasn't really the point. The real lesson wasn't about convictions. It was about warning signs. Power, corruption, greed. The lengths the wealthy will go to protect themselves. When someone threatens to pull back the curtain, Isabella Fairmont's death became more than a crime story. It became a symbol of what happens when truth collides with privilege, and what it costs to challenge the untouchable. So, what about you? Do you think we've heard everything? Or are there still secrets hiding behind the walls of Newport's grand mansions, waiting to be found? Because Isabella paid the ultimate price to make sure someone, someday, would know the truth. If you found this story as haunting as we did, leave a comment below. Tell us what you think really happened on Isabella's last night in Newport. If this story left you looking over your shoulder, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of the Past. There are more secrets waiting in America's forgotten shadows, and some of them are even darker than this, because the truth always finds a way to surface.